Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition, and we now turn to poem 457, Sweet, Safe Houses. And right away, let's just remind ourselves that when we read these Emily poems, we have a tendency to focus on the punctuation, especially all those dashes. And I think there may be a good reason in this poem why Emily will be playing around with the dashes between, notice, the first 6 words all have dashes between every one of them. Do you see this already as we're looking at the poem on the page? And we're going to talk about what's going on. In some ways, in this poem, we're back to the poem 358. And I'll let you go back to do that study on your own. Our assumptions of this poem is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our preceding 456 poems. We just finished with 456 so well that I can live without. Now, scholars are really split on this poem, so let's just say this out loud. Some will read this as an attack on the rich. That is to say, there's a certain kind of disconnectedness, we might say, from the real life and its pains of those who do not have the good stuff of life, those who are disenfranchised, the poor. Emily herself will in fact say of herself in a famous letter that she wrote, letter 265 to Thomas Higginson, that she was of the, quote, barefoot rank, end quote. In other words, those who do not have much. Now, obviously, you can, from your study of Emily, you can make the argument. Emily was definitely middle class, if not upper middle class, by virtue of her means. But nonetheless, that's how Emily perceived herself. Or, some have seen this poem as a satire of modern, as we would say with quotation marks around it, modern funeral homes of the time of Emily Dickinson. What makes this poem so much fun is you get to decide which one of the two renderings or interpretations of the poem you best like. I want you to hear, as I read this poem, all of the S sounds. By the way, even though there are dashes between each of these words, as we have pointed out in the past in our study of the poetry of Emily Dickinson, we normally will read the words together without taking tremendous pauses, even though obviously they are iconic pauses. I mean, when you're looking at the poem on the page, you can't help but notice all of those dashes between the first 6 words. Let's enjoy the poem. Sweet, safe houses, glad, gay houses, sealed so stately tight, lids of steel on lids of marble, locking bare feet out. Brooks of plush in banks of satin, not so softly fall as the laughter and the whisper from their people pearl. No bald death affront their parlors, no bold sickness come, no to deface their stately treasures. Anguish and the tune hum by in muffled coaches, lest they wonder why any for the press of smiling interrupt to die. Now again, how you read this poem will have a whole lot to do with how you read this poem, if you get my drift. In other words, how you interpret this poem will have a lot to do with, is Emily talking about wealthy people that are completely disconnected from normal people, or is she in fact talking about that whole new advent of the modern parlor or funeral home that was starting to crop up all around New England, where you will take a body, you will lay it inside of a really nice coffin, and in fact, there's certain levels of pricing for these coffins, the more satin, the more expensive, and the like. And is Emily making some kind of derisive or satirical comment about those funeral homes? Notice we begin with the observations. Sweet, safe houses. Glad, gay houses. By the way, gay here just means blissful, happy. Okay, it doesn't mean sexual yet. Okay, and then finally notice all the S sounds ends with the third line, sealed so stately tight. Now again, is she talking about the wealthy who get to live behind the walls in the really nice houses? They don't have any sense of what's going on out in the real world? Or is she talking rather about dead bodies in coffins in a funeral home? You get to decide. Lids of steel on lids of marble. Again, are we talking about houses or are we talking about coffins, right? Locking bare feet out. Again, go back to what Emily said in letter 265 to Thomas Higginson. she was of the barefoot rank, speaking of herself, right? Locking bare feet out. Brooks of plush in banks of satin. Again, is she talking about coffins, or is she talking about really nice homes that have been built, right? Not so softly fall as the laughter and the whisper from their people pearl. Now, pearl people, notice her inversion in the way she says it. Pearl people, those who have means, or those who are being decorated post-mortem in their coffins getting ready to be seen. She'll say, now, no bald death affront their parlors. Now, again, this has led some people to talk about this as being the rich. Some, again, talking about it as a funeral parlor. No bold sickness come. Well, if you'll think about it, once you're dead, you don't got to worry about getting sick. So that's at least one good thing about getting dead, is you don't got to worry about, getting ill anymore. Or, when you're wealthy, you don't have to worry so much about the kind of sickness and illness that will come on those who don't have means. To deface their stately treasures, anguish in the tomb. In other words, the wealthy have the ability to kind of put off the anguish that comes with fear of death, at least for a while. Hum by. I love the way she's done this, because, of course, when you look at that word, the two words, it could be easily misinterpreted as humbly, right? Notice the absence of an L. Hum by in muffled coaches. Notice the language here is all about subduing, muffling, right? Silencing in some way. Lest they wonder why any for the press of smiling interrupt to die. In other words, the wealthy can live this isolated life away from the normal difficulties of life. Is that what she's saying? Or is she in fact making some kind of satiric observation about people who are now dead, sealed in their coffins, and therefore don't have to experience all the normal challenges of living? Well, at 2a, depending on how you read this poem, you'll have different messages, right? If you, for example, read this as an attack on the rich, you could argue that she's saying some people lack compassion for normal people and even for the poor, the disenfranchised. If you read this as a satire of the modern funeral home, you'll see this as modern funeral homes maybe lacking some sense of humanity. At 2b, it is interesting, all the S sounds. Go back and read it for yourself. All the S sounds, which almost suggests a certain kind of shh if you're in a funeral home, or s if you're trying to make fun or point out that the wealthy have advantages that those of us who are not wealthy do not possess. At 3a, I can't help but think about Swift's Modest Proposal and the other satiric attempts. I can't help but think about Marx's Communist Manifesto as well a possible connection here. Finally, at 3b, it is, I think, up to you, the reader, to decide, how do you interpret this poem? How do you read this poem? Do you read this poem as an attack, or do you read it as more satiric in some way? I'll leave it to you to decide. Thank you.